Good morning and good afternoon to all. Welcome to another Citi Brazil Live, which comes at a very important time. On behalf of Citi, I would like to welcome Mr. Mansueto Almeida, Secretary of the National Treasury, Mr. Bruno Funchal, Director of Projects and incoming Secretary of the National Treasury, Mr. José Franco Morais, Undersecretary of Public Debt. Gentlemen, thank you for kindly accepting our invitation. It's an honor for us to have you today. Thank you very much again for your participation. This is a great opportunity for our team and for hundreds of our clients from around the globe, corporations, hedge funds, asset managers, and private bank clients who are all connected on this live to hear your message. So I would like to start by asking Secretary Mansueto to give his opening remarks. Please, Secretary.
Okay, Marcelo, thank you very much for inviting us to come here to talk with all the clients of Citi and many others who are here. And thank you, my team, for being here. And the next Secretary of the Treasury, Bruno Funchal, who will take my place in less than 1 month. I will start by saying that pretty much, as you know, we are going through hard times because of the COVID-19. And here in Brazil, it will not be different from the rest of the world. You were expecting, at the beginning of the year, a primary debt around 1.5, 1.6% of GDP, and probably heading to a primary debt near 10% of GDP, or a little bit higher than that, meaning that our gross debt will increase by 15 to 20 percentage points of GDP, which is a lot. But again, have in mind that after this year, we need to deal with the higher debt, but we're going through a time with very, very low interest rate, not only in Brazil, but in the rest of the world. So you have a window of opportunity to approve the necessary measures Brazil needs to approve to boost the GDP growth, because it's very, very important in terms of that sustainability, the GDP growth in the coming years, and also step by step, recover, we get again a primary surplus. Brazil, as I told you, will run a primary deficit this year around 10% of GDP, but have in mind that the huge increase in expenditure, in the public sector expenditure this year, is linked to the COVID-19. The Brazilian Congress gave us a lot of flexibility to increase expenditure, but only temporary expenditures that will start and finish this fiscal year. So next year, the government will need to comply again with the spend cap bill, meaning that next year we already know that it will be necessary to cut the public sector expenditure something around 500 billion reais. It's a lot, around 6% of GDP. So pretty much over 6% of GDP. So pretty much, we will need to face a higher fiscal deficit and a higher debt this year, but last year, the Brazilian government, you go back again to comply with the spend cap bill. And again, in the meantime, we need to improve the political debate in order to approve the reform this country needs to approve to increase the GDP. And these reforms are quite easy to say, but you still need a lot of effort to build the political consensus to get the reforms approved. And one of the most important one is the tax reform. As you know, Brazil has a very high tax burden vis-a-vis the other countries in Latin America. The average tax burden in Latin America is around 22, 23% of GDP, and Brazil has a tax burden around 33% of GDP, 10 percentage points higher than the average for Latin America. And in addition to that, we have a very, very complex tax system. A tax system where you pay your income tax doesn't depend on your income, depends on your labor contract. So we need to fix that. And I think, the Congress nowadays, it's very sensitive to the topic of tax reform. It doesn't mean that you have the political support to approve, ambitious tax reform, but at least you have the environment to start a very good debate about tax reform and move forward. Try to build some consensus to approve parts of what we call tax reform. And I think this will be very, very important, not only this year, in the next year as well. Also, we need to approve the administrative reform because the public sector in Brazil doesn't work, in a very efficient way. When you come to work for the public sector, your initial salary is very, very high, but your final salary is not that high. And there are many problems. If you are a young, that you just left the college and you come to work for the public sector, when you are 22 years old, when you reach 32, 34 years old, you already reached the top of your career. So it's a very short career. The initial salary is very, very high, and the final salary now not always is very high. So we need to fix that. The administrative reform, the goal is not, to lay off workers. The administrative reform goal is to improve how the public sector works in Brazil. So this will be, very, very, very important. And many other reforms. Like, for instance, this week, the Senate in Brazil will bring to the floor to vote a new regulatory framework for the sanitation, which is very, very important. And I think we will approve the law. I think this year we might approve, the legislation giving independence for our central bank. So there are many reforms that I don't think will have problem to get it approved in the Congress. But tax reform, administrative reform, they're very sensitive topics. Sometimes you have a consensus, but when you start debating the details, you don't have that consensus. So you need to promote the political debate in order to see what we can get it approved in the coming next year, probably this year, but probably next year, it'll be terrific. And again, Brazil has many problems, as you know, but in the last 4 years, have in mind that despite all the political polarization in Brazil, because before this government, we had the government, Temer's government, that I participate as well, that was in the government as well. In Temer's government, we're talking about our government that the approving rate was lower than 10%. But despite that, the government was able to approve very important reforms, including the long-term interest rate that completely changed the way subsidized credit worked in Brazil. Before Temer's government, we had huge incentives of subsidized credit going through the treasury to public banks, and this stopped it. This does not happen anymore, except for the agriculture sector that still rely on subsidized credit. But for all the other sectors, we cut a lot in the last 3-4 years, the subsidized credit, which is very good for the efficient, function of the credit market. In addition to that, we changed the labor legislation. Have in mind that the labor legislation in Brazil comes from the 1940s. And after many decades in a very weak government that came through an impeachment process, we were able to change the labor legislation. And in this government, without a strong political base, at the beginning of the government, we were able to approve the pension reform. And as you know, pension reform is very, very difficult in any place in the world. Take, for instance, the example of France, that Emmanuel Macron has the majority in the Congress, but was not able to approve a pension reform. And here, in this country, after 2 decades, in a new government, without political base, without a strong political base, we were able to approve the pension reform because, of course, there was a topic that was already on the debate in the last 3 years, and we count on with the support of the Congress. That's why I'm a little bit optimistic that if you really promote a very good political debate with transparency, respecting the opposite views, we might be able to build some consensus to approve, if not all, at least part of what we call tax reform. This will be, very, very, very important. But, I've never seen in the last 20 years a Congress so much engaged in this debate of tax reform. There is something that makes me a little bit optimistic. Looking ahead, again, there is no magic. We have at least, I think, 2 or 3 years of very, very low interest rate. You don't have a problem in Brazil with inflation. We'll be navigating in a world with very, very low interest rates. So I think, we have a window, that could be a little bit longer or shorter, but you have a window of very low interest rate that we need to get the benefit of this window of very, very low interest rate to approve reforms to speed the Brazilian GDP growth, and also to consolidate this scenario of low inflation and low interest rate. If you do that, I don't think you have any problem in terms of debt sustainability. because a country like Brazil, a major economy with a gross debt around 95% of GDP is very, very high. Let's not fool ourselves. 95% of GDP of a gross debt to an emerging economy, it's very, very high. But it makes a lot of difference if it's 95% of GDP of gross debt in an economy that is growing 1% or growing over 3%. It's very different. 95% of GDP in a country that the basic interest rate is 2.25, 3 or 4% per year, or in a country that the basic interest rate is 15, 14% per year. And 5 years ago, Brazil was that country. 5 years ago, you were in a country that the inflation was 10% per year, the basic interest rate was over 14%, was 14.25% per year, and the economy, the GDP was falling. This is not the Brazil that I see in the coming years. So pretty much, I'm not that concerned with the level of the debt to GDP. I'm much more concerned whether or not we'll be able to build the political consensus to move forward with the reforms, to boost the GDP growth, and to consolidate the scenario of low inflation and low interest rate. So, this will depend a lot on us. This will depend a lot, on those people who are in the government, as was my case, up to now. And it will depend a lot on the people who are not in the government, who are not in the private sector, to send the right message. So it will be very, very important, to everyone here in Brazil. It doesn't matter if you're in the private sector, if you're in the government, but we need to make a major effort to show that if for some reason the government fails in its economic agenda, it's not a problem of the government. Sometimes people talk about the government as it was a third actor, apart from the society. This is not the case, because if the government fails, in moving forward with its economic agenda, everybody will suffer. It doesn't matter if you're pro or con or against the government. If the economic agenda fails, everybody will pay the bill, and the bill will be very, very high. So pretty much, I will continue to participate in the public debate and try to promote the reform and try to talk to the Congress to show the importance of approving these reforms that the government is sending to the Congress, and those ones that we already sent last year. And I'm pretty much, I'm quite confident that Bruno will continue my job. The economic team in the Treasury will be exactly the same, except for the Secretary of the Treasury, that now will be Bruno Funchal 1 month from now. And again, I don't see this as a problem. I've been in the government for the last 4 years, so I'm a little bit tired of being in the government, but I'm not tired of participating in the public debate, and I will continue to do that. And again, pretty much, what will be Brazil 1, 2, 3, 4 years from now will depend on us. And I think that step by step, under very difficult circumstances, with a very strong political polarization that we still see today in Brazil, and this is the case in many other places in the world, but at least, in the middle of this strong political polarization, in the last 3, 4 years, this country was able to approve many, many important reforms, as already told. So I don't think this will change. But again, it will depend a lot on us, to promote what I call a good political debate. Because if you fail to do that, there is no magic. If you screw up, if you don't approve what we need to approve to boost the GDP growth, of course, we have a high bill and problems in the future. But this is not the case up to now. This is not the case right now. In terms of the debt, I think Franco is here, can talk a little bit about that. But, at this point, we don't have any problem in terms of selling bonds. But of course, since we have a very, very steep yield curve, we are focusing on raising money in the short term. We're selling short-term bonds. That's the basic strategy of the Treasury, financing this year. Yesterday, some people were asking me why I'm not selling, or why I don't try to sell, more of long-term bonds. It doesn't make any sense, because I think the yield curve is still very, very steep, and it doesn't make sense to do that. So you're focusing this year on short-term bonds, and of course, long-term bonds. The traditional buyers of long-term bonds in Brazil are foreigners and pension funds. And even before the COVID-19 crisis, they were a little bit absent of the market. It doesn't mean that we will not be selling long-term bonds. You do that. You continue to do that. But our major focus in terms of raising revenue for the Treasury to pay the extra expenditures, you'll be focusing on the selling of short-term bonds. And again, I mean, sometimes people ask me, okay, but the interest rate went down sharply. Now the basic interest rate is 2.25 in Brazil. Don't you afraid of not selling short-term bonds? I'm not afraid about that, because in the worst case scenario, we have to pay a premium. But even if you take into account that we need to pay a premium, sometimes, the final cost of a bond, the final interest rate will still be lower than what it was, 1 month ago, 6 months ago, 2 years or 3 years ago. And again, and also raising some revenue, international market. We issued foreign bonds, I think it was 3-4 weeks ago. And also we signed a contract with multilateral institutions to raise also some money. So pretty much, I mean, I don't see any problem in terms of raising money to pay for disaster expenditure, and also to increase again our cash cushion, because our cash cushion is very important, because next year in 2021, the beginning of the year, you have the maturity of a large amount of bonds that were issued back in 2015. So we also, take into account that in terms of building our cash cushion. So pretty much that's my initial remarks. I can pass to Bruno or Franco to give some initial comments to open to Q&A.
Thank you. Bruno or Franco, do you want to make any opening remarks, or should we go straight to Q&A?
Well, in terms of that, first of all, thank you very much, Marangon and Citigroup for the invitation. Well, in terms of debt management, I guess Secretary Mansueto, made a very good overview. But anyway, I just would like to emphasize that, given, of course, in spite of the restricted fiscal space, that the government has, we entered this crisis in a very good situation in terms of debt management. I will explain why. Of course, as Mansueto said, we started with something like 77% of debt GDP ratio. Our expectation is to end this year at the low 90s, which is quite high for an emerging economy like Brazil. But anyway, we also have some positive aspects. One of them is the composition. Given the type of crisis that we have right now, this is the first crisis that Brazil enters. That an interest rate cut is the response of the monetary authority, instead of an interest rate rise, right? And considering the composition of the debt, with almost 60% of the gross debt indexed to the Selic rate, we can get, all the benefits from that. Right, and on the other hand, we are in such an environment with the BRL, the local currency more depreciated, and we have a very low FX exposure. So this is a positive signal, right? Another one is the liquidity reserves that we have. In spite of the fact that the primary deficit to be financed through a bond selling increased a lot. We started the year expecting something like 1.5% of GDP, and we are going to something like 90, maybe even 10% of GDP. It doesn't mean necessarily that we have to rush, to raise money through bond selling, right? Given that we have this liquidity cushion, right? And we can manage, the bond sales, with the use of cash reserves, right? That's basically it,
Perfect. Bruno, would you like to make any comments before we start the Q&A?
I think Bruno is having some problem with the internet connection.
Yeah. that's fine. So while he fixes the technical problems, just thank you very much for the opening remarks. And I think Mansueto and Franco, you both touched on many points that I think the audience want to listen in more details, right? And given that we have many international investors on the line, I think if you agree, what we'd like to discuss quickly is what was already done, what is being discussed, what will be the impact on the fiscal accounts, and how do you see the government managing the fiscal situation going forward. So just starting what was already done, all of us have been following the measures being taken. You mentioned the impact on the fiscal deficit for this year. Can you go, please, a little bit more on details on the fiscal impact for 2020? And also if you're going to see these measures as permanent or temporary, which is something, Mansueto, that you have been very vocal about.
Okay, I mean, let's stress the numbers. First, I mean, at the beginning of the year, the target for the central government primary deficit was something around 124 billion reais, which is a little bit over 1.5, 1.6% of GDP, and a very, low deficit for subnational government and state companies. At the aggregate, we're expecting something around 120 billion reais of primary deficit that now is heading to 700 billion or 800 billion reais. So probably, the public sector deficit, primary deficit, will be something near 700 to 800 billion reais. Just to give you a glance, last year, this number for the Brazilian public sector was 61 billion reais. Last year, the primary deficit, 2019, primary deficit for the Brazilian public sector was 61 billion reais, 0.9% of GDP. This year, the positive scenario will be something around 10 to 11% of GDP. It could be even higher than that. So let's take this into account. When you put on the number the interest payments to see the whole fiscal deficit, last year we're talking about something that was, let's see if I can remember, something near, I think, 6% of GDP of fiscal deficit. And this year, we're talking about something that will be a little bit over 15% of GDP. Depending on the primary deficit, it could be a little bit higher, 16, 17% of GDP of the fiscal deficit. So, this is very huge. You're talking about a fiscal deficit that will be similar to what we see in developed economies. But again, there is a huge difference here in Brazil from any other place, because up to now, we didn't, build any programs that will last for next year. So basically, all the growth in the public sector expenditure will start and finish this fiscal year. So meaning that we are not contaminating next year, except for the revenue side. A part of this huge deficit this year is not coming from the increase in the expenditure. Part of that is coming, probably 1/3 of that is coming from the loss of revenue from the government, because you have a GDP falling around 6 to 7%. And of course, when you have a lower GDP in 1 year, it affects your tax base for the next year as well. So pretty much, part of the deficit that we will have next year, it will come from our, loss of revenue. That's why I'm stressing a lot that in order, to continue with the fiscal adjustment before this crisis, pretty much the only thing that the government needed to do was to comply with the spend cap bill. The spend cap bill is a constitutional rule in Brazil that says that every single year, the federal government can only increase the expenditure by inflation. It cannot increase the expenditure over inflation. So the idea is that the central government expenditure GDP will fall year after year, because year after year, if you have a real growth in your GDP, since your expenditure is increasing only by inflation, the relationship between central government expenditure and GDP will fall gradually over the years. Now things changed, because before the crisis, we were expecting that by the end of this government, we would have a primary surplus. This is not the case anymore, not because of the expenditure, but much more because of the revenue. Because since you have, a GDP falling around 6 to 7% this year, you lose revenue this year and the next one as well. So because of that, I think in the coming years, not necessarily only in 2021, but I think in the next, 3-4 years, the government, you need to do some effort to recover the revenue. Part of the revenue, of course, will bounce back, will increase again when the economy starts growing again. But but even I think the government will need to go beyond that. I think we need to do some kind of effort to recover part of the revenue that we lose, that we already lost, and that we will lose in the future. And again, I mean, in Brazil, we have many special tax regimes. When I mean to recover part of the revenue that the government will lose, it doesn't mean that we need to increase tax burden, because tax burden in Brazil is already very high. But we have many special tax regimes in Brazil, and things that you can deduct from your taxable income that it doesn't make any sense. So I could quote many different programs, but again, we can deal with that. We can at least, get 0.5 to 1% of GDP if we change these special tax regimes. And again, in addition to that, we need to comply with the spend cap bill, because if you don't do anything on the revenue side, probably you won't have primary surplus in this government at the end of next government in 2026. So it's too long. We cannot accept that. So I think now the challenge of the Brazilian government is two. One, comply with the spend cap bill. Second, we need to do something on the revenue side. In the short term, 2021, 2022, I think we need to speed up the process of privatization and concessions. As the government was already doing last year, we saw Petrobras, which our company in the oil sector, selling assets. We saw the public banks in Brazil, especially BNDES, this year in February, selling share equities of Petrobras. We will need to continue to do that very, very fast, and we really need to make a lot of efforts to privatize Eletrobras. If the agenda of privatization concession was important before the crisis, it will be even more important after the crisis. So we need to do that, to help us in the fiscal side, and also to increase productivity of these companies, because in the case of Eletrobras, the company will need to invest a lot, and being in the public sector, it's not possible to do the investment. The company needs to grow. So pretty much, we need to tackle these opportunities of speeding up the concession and privatization in the short term, in 2001, 2002. And in addition to that, we need to do something with our special tax regime to try to get some additional help coming from the revenue side to help with the fiscal adjustment. But the big numbers are this. Primary deficit, 10-11% of GDP this year for the public sector. Fiscal deficit, including interest payments, 15-16% of GDP. Gross debt, 95% of GDP. Net debt, 65 to 66% of GDP. But next year, things got a little bit, last year, things get better because, again, all the growth in the expenditure are temporary, so they will not, go through the next year. And next year, again, part of the increase in the debts this year is linked to the increase of liquidity coming from the central bank. That next year, central bank will do the opposite. So this will help us a lot. This will help us again in stabilize the gross debt to GDP next year. So our major problem is this year. And again, whether the fiscal convergence in the coming years will be faster or slower, it will depend a lot on what we approve in the next 1-2 years of reforms in the Congress, because this will make a lot of difference in terms of GDP growth. So I'm not quite worried up to now at this point with that sustainability. I could be worried 1 year or 2 years from now if you fail to approve anything and for some reason you don't comply with the spend cap deal. And then I'll be worried. But at this point, I'm not worried about that. Because again, it's crucial that the government understands, that everybody here understands that you have a window of opportunity. This window of opportunity, it can be longer or shorter, but it's the time that you have very, very low interest rates. So you need, really to make a major effort during this time to approve reforms and move ahead with the economic agenda. Again, I think it's possible. Again, as I told you, we need to explain to the Congress, to explain to the population the challenges, and also to explain what will happen in this country if you fail to continue in this positive trend that we were before the crisis. Last year, for the first time after 5 years, we were able to cut the gross debt to GDP. And pretty much, without the COVID-19 crisis, you were heading to another year of cutting the gross debt to GDP. but with the COVID-19, things changed. But again, next year we need to move back to the track, to the trend of doing the fiscal adjustment. But I think it's possible.
No, thank you very much. Very clear, Mansueto. Now, Franco, you made some comments on your opening remarks, but just to go a bit more, I think, in details, what is the plan to finance these extraordinary fiscal measures taken? And should we expect a change in the funding strategy of the National Treasury?
Well, Marangon, as Mansueto mentioned, I mean, we have quite a steep yield curve in Brazil at this point, right? With the basic interest rate at 2.25, and the 10-year, which is the long part of the curve for the Brazilian case, at least. At around 7%, 7.5%, it's I guess the best choice would be to shorten the debt, right? I mean, but what I mean exactly by shortening the debt, right? Our main tools of financing are, the bills, which in Brazil was, runs up to 4 years. I'm talking about, the fixed rate, zero coupon bonds, right? And the floaters, right? So the main financing tools, will be those zero coupon fixed rate bonds, 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, right? And the floaters, which maturity is 6 years. Right, and it's important to mention that they are both zero coupons, right? So we are not going to have a higher burden in the next few years, but only when the bond actually matures, right? And that's basically it. I mean, there is nothing new to do, right? I mean, we have quite a stable schedule for bond auctions, right? And we have done some minor adjustments, right? But those are the main instruments that we have, right? And on the top of that, I mean, as Mansueto mentioned, given the low exposure to FX that we have, it's around 5% of the total debt. I mean, there is room to increase external debt, right? I mean, we issued a bond like 3 or 4 weeks ago, quite successfully. And besides that, we are working on loans with multilateral banks, right? It's a minor amount considering the total financing needs that we have, something like $4 or $5 billion, right? But it's this is what I call the low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, it's a low-cost loans, so which is we can take the benefit of the availability of those resources, right? And I mentioned before, I mean, we always have the cash cushion, right? I mean, I guess the first market reaction was a lot of volatility that we saw back on the middle March, right? And but since then, I mean, we have quite a meaningful buyback program. We bought back something like 35 billion reais. So, the main purpose of that program was to reduce market risk, and on the other hand, we found a good opportunity, to buy back bonds at higher yields, right? But anyway, since we have the cash cushion, we can manage, the bond selling with the use of cash cushion. Right, I used to say that the cash cushion is in quite a comfortable situation. Of course, this is going to change, along the months. But anyway, we still aim at having a prudential level of the cash cushion, right? So we are not necessarily in a rush just to raise money in the market. But anyway, the situation at this point is much more stable than it used to be back in March or early April, right? And we are seeing a stable demand for in the auctions. Right. I guess once the scenario gets clearer, you know, the level of uncertainties tend to dissipate, right? And then we can just go on with our program of bond auctions.
Thank you. Very glad to hear that, Franco. Thank you very much. Now back to Secretary Mansueto. Moving to country rating, right? So the goal of getting back to investment grade obviously was delayed because of this crisis. So what are the new perspectives? What's your view on timeline? And what could be the triggers to achieve it?
You know, it's quite difficult, I mean, to bet on a specific year that we will recover the investment grade again. But again, what's important for the rating agency, and I talk a lot with them, I already talked with them, you know, this year in March and April, after the COVID-19. And again, what the rating agency care a lot is, you know, it's the trend. I mean, it doesn't matter if you promise to recover the investment grade in 4, 5, or 6 years from now. What really is important is to give the correct signals to the investors that you're doing, that you're approving the reforms, that you're moving ahead, even if it's gradual, but that we are doing concrete steps, moving forward. In solving our problems, which will be a very high deficit, a high debt, and I mean, if the numbers get better, this will reflect, you know, in the reports of the rating agency. So pretty much this year, I mean, rating agencies were very, very worried about the political polarization in Brazil because, you know, in a democracy, and you need to, you know, and you need to acknowledge that in a democracy, you need to have the support of the Congress to approve reforms, especially, you know, in a country like Brazil. In Brazil, we have over 28 political parties in the Congress. But again, as I told you, last year, we approved a pension reform without having a strong political base. And this year, despite the strong political polarization that continues, we see the federal government taking steps to build a political base, even inviting political parties to participate in the government. At the beginning of this government, the president and then you know, the new government was very reluctant of inviting traditional politicians to participate in the government. And now the government is doing that. The government is inviting many politicians to participate in the government in order to try to build a political base in the Congress. So I think this might, at the end, this might even help you know, to approve reforms. Many people says that, oh, but the government is doing, you know, political alliance with traditional political parties. But again, everything that we approved in this country in the last 4 years, we needed and we counted on the support of the traditional political parties. So in order to get the political base that we need to move forward with the reform, we need to rely on the traditional political parties, as it is the case in any other democracy. So again, I mean, what will be key for the rating agency is, you know, it's to see that we're really doing our homework, that the fiscal deficit will get, you know, lower and lower in the coming years, that the GDP growth will be higher, and that when you look forward at some point in 2025 or 2026, we will see the debt, the gross and net debt in Brazil reaching a peak and starting, I mean, falling again. So that's what will be key, because in terms of foreign exchange risk, for instance, I don't see that as a problem in a country that you have 20% of GDP in reserves. So pretty much, I mean, our situation is quite different, for instance, to what was back in the 1990s, and also in the 2022. In the 1990s, Brazil had a problem with lack of reserves, and we had to, you know, to get a loan from IMF. This is not the case anymore. We don't need any loan, you know, in foreign currencies. Second, in 2002, when we had a problem, stability in the market, because people were afraid of a left-wing political government that was elected in 2022, you know, 40% of our debt was linked to the exchange rate, so was linked to the exchange risk. This is not the case anymore. And in 2015, we had a problem that the interest rates were very high. This is not the case anymore again. And as I told you, in terms of that sustainability, it's very, very important when you take into account your real interest rate vis-a-vis the real GDP growth, and also the expectation regarding the GDP growth. So again, we can make we can make all these numbers, all these projections, these estimates to get better. We can speed up the GDP growth if you approve the reforms, and again, if you move forward with the economic agenda, approving reforms, I think we will consolidate the scenario of low inflation, low interest rates. So pretty much, it depends on us, and that's what the rating agencies, expect to see. They wanted to see if you're going to be able to continue to approve and to do the homework that we promised to them 1, 2, 3, 4 years ago. Until, recently, we were being succeeding in doing that. We were succeeding in doing that. But again, it's now is a new word, and we need to continue to do that to, at some point, recover the investment grade. But again, the Brazilian risk, the CDS, the 5-year CDS, at the beginning of this year went down to something around 100 basis points. Pretty much, it was the level that we had when we had the investment grade some years ago. So pretty much we were on the right track to recover the investment grade. Of course, now it will need some more time. But again, I'll not stress too much when, but I will stress how. So it's much more important to show how you're going to be on the track to recover in the future the investment grade than to say when. So that's my main message.
No, thank you. Very clear. Keeping on the very same lines, Secretary Mansueto, you mentioned a lot of measures that were already done, some that are being discussed, and others that the country should prioritize, right? So you mentioned the obedience to the spend bill, revenue-driven initiatives, privatization, concessions, tax reform. But as a foreign investor to Brazil, how would you rank the most important measures for us to see in the near term for us to achieve this fiscal stability and also, make the rating agencies comfortable and the investors' appetite towards Brazil at the very high levels?
Again, I think one of the most important reforms, but it's really difficult to say right now, what's the political consensus behind this reform? It's not clear to answer this question, is the tax reform. Because, if you're a foreign investor, I've already talked a lot with many foreign investors that comes to Brazil, and they always tell me, when I ask them, what worries you about investing in Brazil? It's the low education of the labor force, it's the bad quality of our infrastructure, it's the red tape, and they always tell me that, listen, I don't concern with that, because everything that you're telling me, it's already on my price. So if you're going to buy my product here in Brazil, it'll be more expensive than what we would buy to buy the same product in the United States, in Germany, in France. So pretty much, all this, our structural problems, the entrepreneurs can put on the price. But there is something that foreigners, the entrepreneurs, they cannot deal with. It's changing rules. When you have a tax system that you every single year you start changing the tax rules, and sometimes moving backwards. So this is really, really bad for a foreign investor. That's why I put the tax reform as a very important measure in terms of increasing the prospect of foreign investment in Brazil, and also to boost the GDP growth. But we need to present a tax reform to start in the debate, because if you ask anyone if it's in favor of tax reform, everybody will say, yes, of course, I'm in favor of tax reform. But it doesn't mean anything, because you need to look on the details. And that's why I think, probably 1 month from now, probably in August, at some point in August, I think the government will send its proposal to the Congress. And then we will have a debate, because you have the federal government proposal send in the Congress. You have another proposal of building a VAT that is already in the Congress. So we may start to have a good debate and approve, if not the whole tax reform, at least part of it. I think the tax reform will be an agenda that will last this government in the next one. But again, it's very, very important to move ahead with this agenda. So I would put tax reform in a very, very important reform. The other one, of course, I mean, is to comply with the spend cap bill. Again, I mean, we are in a country that have if you check it out, the COVID-19 expenditure and go next year with all the problems that you have, with a lower tax base, etc. We're talking about a country that will have a primary deficit between 2 and 3% of GDP, which means that we're talking about a fiscal deficit, including interest payments, between 6 to 7% of GDP. So, I mean, we need to do a fiscal adjustment in the coming years, at least around 4 percentage points of GDP. So 4 percentage points of GDP, I mean, a country that already has a very high tax burden, of course, we need to recover part of the tax revenue that we will lose. But again, the focus, we still need to try to comply with the spend cap bill in the coming years, to try, to cut a little bit more our public sector expenditure. So, again, the market that I expect that this government in the next 2.5 years that we still have, that this government will approve all the reforms that Brazil needs, that this government, will completely change the economy. But it's very, very important, to not have any kind of, we cannot move backwards. We can continue to move forward, even if you fail to approve part of the reforms that we intend to approve, that we intend to submit to the Congress. And I think the key point in terms of, showing the investor that we are committed, to improve things in this country, is to comply with the spend cap bill, do something in terms of tax reform, and it's very, very important, because you need private sector. Improve our regulatory frameworks, because again, we need to invest a lot in infrastructure, in energy, in sanitation, and we don't have the means. We don't have, the public sector revenue to do this investment. We need to rely on the private sector. In order for the private sector to come, we need to put upfront a very, very good regulatory framework. And if you do that, there you come. Again, when politicians are talking to me saying that we need to increase public investment, I explain to them to show that, listen, what we called in this country public investment 10 years ago, it's not public investment anymore. Look to the case of airports. 10 years ago, all the airports in Brazil were public owned, were the state companies. And now, I mean, you're doing full concession of airports, and all the best, operators of airports worldwide are coming to Brazil. So, I mean, we need to continue to do that, not only with airports, in the energy sector, with new auctions of oil, new auctions of hydroelectrics, many things. I mean, transportation, we need sanitation now that we hope to approve today. So, I mean, it will be very, very important, to get a very good regulatory framework and invite private investors to come to Brazil. If you do that, private investors will come, because after this crisis, everybody will looking worldwide to find good opportunities of investment in a country with very, very low interest rate. So if you put in place a regulatory framework, comply with the spend cap bill, do something on tax reform, and continue the economic agenda, even if you fail in approving any reform, I think the investor will come. And again, I mean, let's not expect that Brazil will solve all the problems in the next 2.5 years, because this will not happen. But it's very, very important to not move backward. We need to move forward. We need to approve part of the reforms. We cannot have any kind of, doubt whether or not the government will comply with the spend cap bill. This is key. This is crucial for, to consolidate the good environment to increase foreign investment and boost the GDP growth in Brazil in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you very much. You touched a lot on the next question, which was related to the spending cap, Secretary Mansueto. So you have been clearly a big advocate of the compliance of the spending cap. So are we in the private sector. And but there is this controversy about how to free up the cap so you can increase the public investments. You just mentioned properly, which we also agree and support, that there is a lot of interest from the private sector to have more protagonism. But within that context, do you see political alignment to have the state, the public sector, with a less participation on investments and more space and protagonism to the private sector?
Have in mind that, any country, in Brazil is not different. Everybody doesn't like, people don't like fiscal adjustment. So everybody, you hear someone complaining about, controlling expenditure growth, especially in a country that from 1997 to 2015, the central government expenditure growth was around 6% real terms per year. So you're talking about a country that every single year, in average, from 1997 to 2015, the financial central government expenditure growth was 6% per year. So pretty much people complain about, lack of fiscal space to increase public investment, especially politicians. But again, there is no better alternative. We need to explain this to them and to show that, listen, we can increase investment, and this country needs to increase investment by at least 5 to 6 percentage points of GDP, but we can do that. Rely on the private sector. We need to focus the public sector on those functions, in those areas that really, we expect that the public sector will make difference. And have in mind that, there is no way, suppose that we didn't have a spending cap bill, that the government could have, full, freedom to increase public investment. This doesn't mean that we'll be able to do that in a very efficient way, because, do a good investment, you need a lot of planning. And the only thing that the government can do very, very fast in terms of public investment is to buy helicopters. And I don't think buying helicopters will increase your potential GDP growth. So pretty much, let's not fool ourselves. There are some functions, some sectors, public education, public elementary education, public health system, that you need to rely on public investments. But again, in many parts, in many important projects that use it to link with public investment in highways, investment in airports, in the energy sector, this can be private investment nowadays. So I don't think, that we need to explain. We need to explain to politicians, we need to explain to the society that, it's better to focus, to rely on private sector. If for some reason, some people don't have, the means to have access to to an investment that was made by the private sector, that, it makes sense to give subsidy to low-income people to have access to water, to have access, to energy. But, this is a specific case. But again, we need to rely on the private investment and the private sector to do the investment in Brazil in the next 2-3 years, because you still need to do a fiscal adjustment, and you won't have the fiscal space to increase the public investment by 1, 2, 3, or even lower than 2 or 3, 4 percentage point of GDP to do the investment this country needs. So how are we going to react to that? Talking and explaining. Everybody in the world, people expect from the government a lot of things beyond what the government can actually deliver. So we need to explain to them and see there is no alternative, that it will be better to bring private investment and continue in the scenario of very low inflation, very low interest rates, and the economy growing again.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we are reaching the end of the session. I think I would like just to make one final question, which we got a lot of comments, which is your view on the amplification of measures to support low-income individuals, right? So while all of us agree, what can we afford? And what's your view on how the discussion is being taken currently at the government?
I think, we can do a lot, but I think that the public debate is a little bit, going the wrong direction. In what terms? Because, if you take into account everything that Brazil spends on what we call welfare states, let's say public education, public health, social assistance, and pension, we're talking about a country that we spend around 25% of GDP. This is quite similar to a rich country in Europe. So, Brazil spends a lot on social policy, on our welfare state. It's as big as it is in a European country. But we have a problem of composition. When you take into account, the distributive effect of taxation and spending in Brazil, it's very inefficient. In a country like UK, in England, the government is able to cut the income inequality around 30 to 35%. When you take into account taxation and spending, in Brazil, spend exactly something quite similar to England. Brazil cuts the income inequality by only 14, 12%. So it's very inefficient. So the point that we need to put on the table and to debate is how to change the composition of our social policy to make it more distributive. And that's the key challenge, because in Brazil, you have some programs, that doesn't make any sense in terms of, benefit for low-income families. For instance, we have in Brazil, you have the 13th salary, but, you have a program that is the 14th salary, what is called a bônus salarial. If you are a worker in Brazil and you work less than 2 minimum wage per month, you are entitled to have a 14th salary. Again, 50% of workers in Brazil of formal labor contracts, they earn less than 2 minimum wage per month. So 50% of our labor force are entitled to receive a 14th salary. I'm not criticizing the program per se, but in a country like Brazil, it doesn't make any sense. I think it would be better to take this whole money that we talk something about 0.2, 0.3% of GDP and transform in a complement in new funds to the conditional cash transfer program, Bolsa Família. The Bolsa Família in Brazil, the conditional cash transfer program, it's a program that it works very, very well. It's very well targeted, and the cost is 0.5% per year, 0.5% of GDP. So it's much better. To increase this program by 50%, that will cost you 0.25% of GDP. Then increasing, as I told you, the total spending on social policy, because what you already spend in social policy, what we call welfare state, is high. It's quite similar to a rich country in Europe. But the problem in Brazil is the composition. For instance, over 50%, what we call welfare state, is spending on pensions. We already approved the pension reform last year, but the effect of pension reform is be very gradual. So pretty much, I will deal with the composition of the social spending, not increasing the total social spending. It's the only way to do that. But I think it's a good debate. But again, we need to explain that we can deal with that we can improve social policy in Brazil without increasing the total expenditure, the total spending on social policy.
Perfect. Very clear. Thank you very much. I think before we end, I think we got Bruno Funchal back. We missed his opening remarks. I don't know if you want to make any comments before we end the session. Bruno, can you hear us? I think we lost Bruno.
Bruno, unfortunately, Bruno is in the ministry. He's, and probably having some problem with the internet connection. But again, let's just say one point. Bruno has a lot of experience in public finance. He was the Secretary of Finance in the state of Espírito Santo in Brazil. And the state of Espírito Santo was the only state in Brazil with the rating A from the Treasury. So Bruno knows quite a lot about public finance. And Bruno is very close to many of congressmen as well. And I think, he'll do a terrific job. And again, the whole team, including Franco, will be together with Bruno. Bruno, do you want to, can you hear us? Can you say something? I was telling about you. And pretty much, all the guidelines that I've been following this last year, I think Bruno will do the same, even better. So pretty much, I'm quite confident that nothing will change in terms of the treasury. Bruno, can you tell some words here?
First of all, I'd like to apologize for my internet problem. I don't know if you are listening well.
Yes.
But I'm listening not so good during all this conversation. No, just to keep my words the same as Mansueto. We work to continue his great job, and we feel free to get another calls, and we are looking forward to continue this to achieve our main goals concerning the fiscal agenda, and in a broad conversation and debate and political debate with the Congress and all the population. It's okay.
Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, it was a pleasure to mediate this live. On behalf of Citi and our clients, I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Secretary Mansueto, for your contribution to the National Treasury. Bruno, please, congratulations on this very important nomination and count on all of us. I would also like to thank Franco and all the team at the National Treasury for the availability, support, and dedication to our country. Thank you again for taking the time of your busy schedule to participate in this live event. It is critically important for the government to ensure that investors and markets understand the government's priorities and the steps you are taking to revitalize Brazil's economy. Please keep counting on us. Thank you very much again for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.